The third wave experiment. There are moments in history when a single idea, small, contained, almost innocent, unfolds into something much greater than anyone expected. Not because of elaborate planning, nor because of complex systems, but simply because of human nature laid bare. The third wave was one such moment. It began in 1967 in an ordinary classroom at Cubberley High School in Palo Alto, California. The teacher was a young man named Ron Jones, energetic and idealistic, known for his unconventional teaching methods. He taught history, not the kind memorized for tests, but the kind meant to be lived and understood. At the time, his students were studying World War II, and specifically the rise of authoritarian regimes. One question kept surfacing again and again. How could so many ordinary people follow such extreme ideologies? Why didn't they resist? How could a society allow itself to be swept into such dangerous conformity? The students asked sincerely, but the answers remained vague. People are easily influenced, the textbook said. They were afraid. They didn't know better, but to Jones, these explanations weren't enough. So without asking permission, without informing parents or administration, he made a choice. He decided to show them. What followed was a psychological journey, a live demonstration of how easily structure, discipline, and a desire to belong could turn into something far more powerful. On Monday, Jones walked into his classroom with a new tone, crisp, deliberate, formal. He rearranged the seating. Desks were placed in rigid rows. When he spoke, it was with authority. No more casual conversation. He introduced the concept of strength through discipline. The students were instructed to sit up straight, respond to questions in short, direct sentences, and repeat slogans in unison. At first, it felt like a game, an experiment in classroom control. But something unexpected happened. The students responded, not just with obedience, but with enthusiasm. They seemed to enjoy the structure, the clarity. Confusion disappeared. There were clear rules and everyone knew their place. There was order, and it felt safe. By Tuesday, Jones added a new concept, strength through community. The students were given a name, the third wave. It sounded official, almost real. They created a salute, right arm bent at the elbow, fingers curled, and were told to use it whenever they saw one another, even outside class. What started as an educational demonstration began to take on a life of its own. Students not in the class grew curious. Some asked to join. By midweek, over 30 new students had enrolled in the class voluntarily. Membership became a source of pride. Students began tattling on those who broke the rules or refused to participate. Posters were created. Slogans spread. The classroom turned into a headquarters. Jones, now uneasy but committed to the unfolding lesson, introduced even more structure, a student task force, special assignments, strict attendance. Students wrote essays praising the movement. They stood in lines. They chanted in rhythm. Individual identity began to dissolve into collective identity. We are the third wave, they said. Together, we are strong. It was no longer about history, it was real. By Thursday, things had grown even more intense. Rumors circulated. The third wave was said to be part of a larger national movement. Some students believed it. Others hoped it was true. The boundaries between experiment and reality blurred. Jones received reports of students threatening others who didn't conform. A girl cried after being shunned by classmates. One student followed him home, offering to serve as his personal bodyguard. It wasn't just a classroom project anymore. It was a psychological wildfire. Jones realized he had to end it. But how? Simply canceling the experiment might cause confusion or resentment. The students had invested emotionally in the movement. They believed it. So he devised a final act. On Friday, he gathered the students in the school auditorium. Over 200 had now joined the movement. The room was filled with anticipation. Banners adorned the walls. Students wore armbands. They stood at attention, waiting for a televised address from the true leader of the third wave, a national figure who would reveal the next phase of the plan. The lights dimmed. The projector flickered on, but there was no broadcast. Instead, Jones played footage from the Nuremberg rallies, giant gatherings under authoritarian rule, where thousands had saluted in perfect unison. Scenes of speeches, flags, marching. Then came images of the war, the destruction, the aftermath. Jones turned to the silent students and spoke. "There was no national movement," he said. "There never was. You've been a part of a lesson, a simulation, an attempt to understand how easy it is for good people to abandon reason, to follow blindly, to trade their voice for the comfort of belonging." He said, "You thought you were special. You thought you were part of something bigger than yourselves. But what you were part of was fascism." The room fell into a stunned, profound silence. Some students cried. Others looked away. A few were angry. The sense of betrayal was real. But so was the lesson. In just 5 days, Jones had created a living microcosm of authoritarianism, complete with structure, loyalty, exclusion, and blind obedience. All it took was a uniform tone, a few slogans, and the promise of unity. The third wave experiment was never published in academic journals. It remained unofficial, whispered about more than written down. Yet its impact rippled through generations. It has been adapted into novels, plays, films, and documentaries, not because of its scientific rigor, but because of its haunting truth. The line between education and manipulation is thin, the line between belonging and conformity even thinner. The third wave showed how easily we surrender our individuality, not because we're evil or weak, but because we crave certainty, structure, and the feeling of being part of something larger. What's most chilling is that there were no villains, no cruel orders, no punishments, just the quiet current of group dynamics, pulling people along, one small choice at a time. As you drift now into sleep, think of how many movements began not with violence, but with unity, not with orders, but with invitation, not with fear, but with purpose. The waves we join are not always the ones we understand, and sometimes the current is strongest where the water seems calmest. The Monsterous metaphor experiment. In a quiet corner of the psychological sciences, where ideas are often more unsettling than comforting, an experiment emerged that attempted to uncover something deeply embedded in the way we speak and think about others. It didn't involve shocking machines or cages, nor did it take place in dimly lit laboratories with mirrors. This one was subtler, yet perhaps more disturbing in its implications. The year was 2011. Psychologists at Stanford University, led by Lera Boroditsky and Paul Thibodeau, posed a simple question: how do metaphors shape our judgments, especially when we're trying to make moral or political decisions? What they uncovered would suggest that even a single word, carefully chosen, could quietly redirect a person's thinking in ways they were completely unaware of. The study was called the Beast versus the Virus Experiment, though it would later become known by a far more unsettling name, the Monstrous Metaphor Experiment. Participants were told a short story about a fictional city called Addison. The city, according to the story, was facing a serious crime wave. Burglary and assault were up. Car thefts and home invasions were spiraling. But here was the twist. In some versions of the story, crime was described as a beast ravaging the city. In others, it was called a virus infecting the city. That was the only difference. Just one word. After reading the short narrative, the participants were asked to suggest solutions to Addison's crime problem. And here, the metaphor worked its dark magic. Those who read that crime was a beast overwhelmingly called for aggressive measures. More policing, longer sentences, and harsh crackdowns. But those who had read that crime was a virus leaned in a different direction. They wanted to investigate the causes: poverty, unemployment, education. They talked about reform, not punishment. All of this from a single word change. But it didn't stop there. When asked afterward what influenced their thinking, nearly all participants said they weren't affected by the metaphor. They believed they made a rational, objective judgment based on the facts. In reality, the metaphor had planted an idea, like a seed, that silently bloomed into a conclusion before they even noticed it was there. It was almost as though the metaphor became the lens through which all information was interpreted. Beast implied something wild, external, and dangerous, something that needed to be hunted and destroyed. Virus, on the other hand, suggested an infection from within, something that needed diagnosis, understanding, and care. What Boroditsky and Thibodeau had stumbled upon was a psychological blind spot, a way in which language, without us realizing it, reshaped our moral compass. It wasn't about changing a person's entire worldview overnight. It was more like nudging them silently, just a few degrees off course, with nothing more than a word. The deeper implications were chilling. If this could happen with a simple metaphor in a story, what about the language we hear every day in news headlines, political speeches, or casual conversation? How often are we being nudged, manipulated, or steered without even noticing it? Are our opinions truly our own, or are they echoes of someone else's metaphors? Boroditsky later explained that metaphors aren't just poetic decorations. They're foundational to the way we think. Our brains, ever in search of meaning, latch onto metaphor as a shortcut. Instead of analyzing each detail analytically, we use metaphors as a kind of cognitive scaffolding. But scaffolding can shape a building as much as it supports it. Even more revealing was the fact that the metaphor had the strongest influence at the very beginning of the story. If the metaphor appeared later, after participants had already formed their own mental model, the effect was diminished. In other words, the earlier the metaphor, the more powerful it became. The first word you hear might be the one that frames everything that follows. In follow-up studies, the researchers tested variations. They found the effect persisted even when participants only saw the metaphor once, buried in a longer paragraph. It didn't matter how rational or logical someone considered themselves to be. The metaphor slipped in unnoticed, and its influence was near imperceptible. This raised haunting questions about public discourse. If policy debates could be swayed so easily by metaphor, what did that say about democracy? If facts were secondary to framing, then perhaps the words we use matter more than we've ever imagined. And so the experiment earned its darker nickname, the Monstrous Metaphor Experiment, because it hinted at a quiet monster, not of flesh and bone, but of language and thought. A monster that doesn't roar or growl but whispers. One that changes your direction not by force, but by suggestion. Imagine, then, a society that constantly describes its issues using the language of war. War on crime, war on drugs, battle against poverty. What kinds of solutions would we expect to emerge from a world framed in endless conflict? Now imagine the same problems framed in the language of health or ecology. Crime as a social fever, poverty as an ecosystem imbalance. The paths we take in response would be entirely different, and it all begins with the metaphor. In the soft quiet of sleep, this may seem like an abstract concern, but every day, whether we know it or not, metaphors are guiding our decisions. They're on the signs we read, the scripts we follow, the thoughts we mistake for our own. The monstrous metaphor isn't out there. It's inside, quietly rearranging the furniture of the mind. And tomorrow, when you wake up and hear the first word of the day, pause. Listen not just to what is said, but how it is said. The monster may already be whispering. The well of despair follow-up. There exists a place in the history of psychology that is rarely spoken of aloud. It doesn't appear often in textbooks, and when it does, it is mentioned quietly, with a certain reluctance, as if even the act of remembering might reawaken something better left forgotten. That place is the well of despair. It was the 1960s, and American psychologist Harry Harlow had already made a name for himself. His research with rhesus monkeys had shown the world the importance of love, comfort, and emotional bonds. In his earlier studies, he had introduced cloth-covered surrogate mothers to young monkeys, showing that emotional connection outweighed even the basic need for food. The findings shook the foundation of behavioral science. But what came next was far darker. The original well of despair was a tall steel chamber. Monkeys were placed inside, isolated from all contact, visual, physical, auditory, for weeks. The purpose? To explore what happened to a living being when it was stripped of all forms of affection. The outcome, as one might expect, was deeply unsettling. But Harlow's later work, the one often referred to as the follow-up, ventured even further into the psychology of emotional separation. In this sequel experiment, Harlow asked, can a broken emotional bond be repaired? Could a monkey who had endured deep emotional deprivation ever recover? Could love, once lost or never known, be learned? To explore this, Harlow created what he called rehabilitation chambers. The isolated monkeys, those that had spent extended periods in the well of despair, were introduced to younger monkeys who had grown up normally. These young, healthy monkeys were chosen for their social ease and emotional stability. Harlow referred to them as therapist monkeys. The results were slow, uncertain, but remarkable. The emotionally damaged monkeys, initially frozen and unresponsive, began, over time, to respond to these gentle, curious companions. At first, they resisted touch, avoided eye contact, and cowered in corners. But the therapist monkeys were patient. They would sit near the withdrawn monkeys, inching closer day by day. They never forced contact. They simply remained, present, available, kind. Weeks passed, then months, and slowly the damaged monkeys began to return. A touch here, a playful movement there, tiny steps toward social reawakening. Harlow was both surprised and deeply moved. After subjecting his subjects to one of the bleakest environments imaginable, he had not expected that hope could still bloom. Yet here it was, not from a drug or a device or an intervention, but from companionship, from warmth, from simple, quiet presence. But what made this follow-up so haunting was the contrast. The image of a monkey slowly crawling out of emotional darkness, guided not by science but by the affection of another, served as a powerful metaphor. It was no longer just about monkeys. It was about humans too, about trauma, abandonment, and the silent suffering that lives in those who've forgotten how to connect. In later reflections, many scholars considered this follow-up experiment as Harlow's way of redeeming himself, or at least the work. Where the original well was a study in despair, the rehabilitation phase became a study in hope, and not hope in a grand, triumphant sense, but in the gentle, quiet persistence of care. Still, it wasn't a simple story of healing. Some monkeys never fully recovered. Some remained withdrawn or developed erratic behaviors. But others made it back. They rejoined their social groups. They played. They bonded. The mere fact that healing was possible became the most profound finding. It also led psychologists to reconsider the human experience of isolation. What does prolonged loneliness do to the mind? And how can one return from that internal exile? Is it ever too late to reconnect? Years later, studies in human psychology echoed what Harlow's monkeys had already revealed. That emotional recovery is not about fixing someone. It's about being with them, sitting beside their silence without forcing them to speak. Offering presence, not solutions. Harlow himself was a complicated figure, brilliant, intense, and emotionally wounded in his own ways. Some said he poured his own pain into his research. Others believed he was trying to understand something that had always eluded him: love. The rehabilitation studies didn't earn him the same acclaim as his earlier work, but they remain a poignant, often forgotten part of psychological history, because they show that even after descent into darkness, even after despair, there can be light. Not all recoveries are fast, not all wounds heal the same, but the presence of another being, curious, patient, and warm, can be enough to bring someone back. The well of despair and its follow-up remain a symbol of the depths one can fall and the fragile, persistent thread that can pull us back. A reminder that no matter how far someone has drifted, connection is never entirely out of reach. As you drift towards sleep, this story may linger, a soft echo in the quiet of your thoughts, that even in the deepest isolation, there remains a path back, narrow perhaps, but real, and it begins with someone who stays. The Heider-Simmel animation study. In the quiet corridors of cognitive science, there exists a study so minimal, so deceptively simple, that it almost seems like a child's project. No brain scans, no electrodes, no long questionnaires. Just a short black and white animation, less than 2 minutes long. Yet what this little film revealed about the human mind would ripple through psychology for decades. It uncovered something subtle, yet profound: the mind's unstoppable urge to find meaning, to tell stories, even when there's nothing there but shapes on a screen. It began in 1944, during a time when much of the world was distracted by the aftermath of war. Psychologists Fritz Heider and Eichmann, working at Smith College in Massachusetts, were interested in a simple but essential question. How do we perceive the world around us? Not just what we see, but what we believe we see. To explore this, they created a short animated film. The entire cast consisted of a few basic shapes: two triangles, one large, one small, and a single circle. These shapes moved around a box with a door that opened and closed. That's all. No words, no faces, no voices, just shapes moving in silence. They then showed the animation to a group of participants and asked a seemingly innocent question: what's happening in this film? The responses were anything but simple. Almost no one described what was actually on the screen. A large triangle moved toward a smaller triangle. A circle exited the box. Instead, they told stories. Complex, emotional, vivid stories. One person said the large triangle was a bully, trying to intimidate the smaller triangle and circle, who were clearly friends. Others described a love triangle. The small triangle and the circle were trying to escape, while the large triangle was jealous, aggressive, trying to separate them. The shapes had emotions, goals, fears. One participant even noted the large triangle's rage when the others locked it out. But none of that was actually there. There were no expressions, no backstories, just geometry, and yet nearly everyone saw a narrative. What Heider-Simmel revealed was a deep truth about the mind, that we are natural storytellers, not just with words, but with perception itself. We don't merely see the world, we interpret it. We assign motives, intentions, personalities, even to lifeless shapes. The mind fills in gaps with meaning because ambiguity is uncomfortable. This experiment laid the foundation for what psychologists now call the theory of mind, the ability to infer the mental states of others, their desires, beliefs, emotions. It's how we navigate social life, how we read body language, how we understand sarcasm or guilt or compassion. But it also comes with a cost. Because if we're wired to see intention even where none exists, then we may sometimes misread the world. We might see threat where there is none. We might believe someone meant harm when they were simply confused. We may turn random coincidence into grand design. It's the same mechanism that makes us believe in luck, karma, or fate. The same impulse that fuels conspiracy thinking or animistic beliefs. The Heider-Simmel film also revealed how quickly we impose human qualities onto the non-human. Today we see this constantly when we yell at our computer for being stupid or feel like our car hates us when it breaks down. We name our robots. We feel guilty closing a chatbot. It's not rational, but it's deeply human. And when we watch movies, even abstract ones, our brains don't ask for realism. They only ask for motion, context, and just enough space to imagine what's going on. Pixar's animators know this well, how a tilt of the head, a flick of an eyebrow, or even a corner of a square-shaped eye is enough to make a digital creature feel alive. But here's the part that stays with you, long after the animation fades. The participants in the Heider-Simmel study didn't just guess at what was happening, they believed it. Their minds had constructed a narrative so convincing that it felt real. The moment you see meaning, you can't unsee it. Even knowing it's all just shapes, the story persists. And this, perhaps, is where the study becomes more than psychology. It becomes a mirror. Because our world is full of moving parts, people coming and going, words and glances, accidents and plans. And every day our minds are stitching these fragments into coherent stories. Not because we want to be deceived, but because meaning is how we survive. We look at the stars and see constellations. We hear thunder and imagine gods. We observe the motions of strangers and write invisible scripts in our minds. Who they are, what they want, whether they're friend or foe. In the end, the Heider-Simmel experiment is not about triangles and circles. It's about us. It asks, how much of what we think is real is simply the story we've created? And how often do we confuse perception with truth? Even now, as you lie still, perhaps drifting, the mind continues its storytelling. You might replay a memory, imagine the sound of someone's voice, or construct scenes that have never happened. entire landscapes of imagination, built from silence. Your mind doesn't stop. It doesn't ask for permission. It simply builds. And in that quiet building lies our most human quality. The Heider-Simmel study is still shown today to students, therapists, even filmmakers, not because of its complexity, but because of its simplicity. It's the kind of truth that hides in plain sight. You don't need words to tell a story. You only need a shape and a mind that's ready to dream. So the next time you see something that feels alive, an inanimate object, a chance encounter, a shadow on the wall, pause and remember. The story may not be in the world at all. It may only be in you. The bystander effect. It's a quiet paradox, one that hides in plain sight, unfolding not in dark laboratories or obscure thought experiments, but in the open, on sidewalks, in city parks, in the ordinary choreography of life. It's the paradox of presence, that sometimes the more people there are around us, the less likely we are to help. This strange phenomenon is known as the bystander effect, and though the term sounds clinical, its roots are emotional, social, and deeply human. To understand it, we must step back, not only into psychological theory, but into a real event that shook the public conscience and forced the scientific world to ask uncomfortable questions about empathy, responsibility, and the silent weight of inaction. The year was 1964, the city, New York. A woman named Kitty Genovese was walking home from work late at night, navigating quiet streets of Queens. What happened next would become one of the most infamous moments in American psychological history, not because of its tragedy alone, but because of how it was perceived. Newspaper reports at the time told a chilling story, that Kitty had been attacked outside her apartment building while 38 of her neighbors watched from their windows, and none intervened. No one came to her aid. No one called for help. She cried out again and again, and the city allegedly stayed silent. That image of dozens of people watching and doing nothing became seared into public consciousness. It haunted scholars and citizens alike. How could so many people fail to act? Though later investigations revealed that the story was more complex and that fewer witnesses saw what happened and some did call for help, the psychological question remained. Why do we sometimes hold back, especially when others are present? Why does responsibility dissolve in a crowd? In 1968, just 4 years after the incident, psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latani set out to investigate. They weren't looking to recreate trauma or assign blame. They were searching for a pattern, a mechanism, hidden in the collective behavior of ordinary people. They designed a series of now famous experiments. In one, participants believed they were part of a discussion about college life, conducted over an intercom system. Each participant was alone in a room, speaking with what they thought were other participants. In truth, the voices were pre-recorded. During the session, one of the participants would begin to speak with increasing distress, describing symptoms of a seizure, slurring their words, then falling silent. The question was simple. Would the real participant seek help, and how quickly? The results were striking. When a person believed they were the only one hearing the emergency, they sprang into action. Most helped, and they helped quickly. But when they believed that others were also listening, their sense of urgency dropped dramatically. Fewer people helped, and those who did took longer to respond. Darley and Latany called this effect diffusion of responsibility. The more witnesses there are, the less any one person feels personally responsible. It's not that people don't care, it's that everyone is silently waiting for someone else to act first. This is the core of the bystander effect. Not cruelty, not apathy, but a quiet hesitation fed by uncertainty and shared presence. Everyone thinks, surely someone else will step in, and in that shared assumption, no one does. The researchers explored the effect in other settings. In one variation, smoke began to fill a room during a simple questionnaire. When a person was alone, they almost always reported the smoke immediately. But when others were present and did nothing, the participant often stayed silent, sometimes until the room became clouded. Why? Because humans are deeply social beings. We look to others for cues, especially in ambiguous situations. If no one else seems concerned, we assume it's not an emergency. This is known as pluralistic ignorance. where everyone privately thinks something is wrong, but because no one acts, everyone assumes it must be fine. It's a quiet psychological trap. We take our cues from others, who are taking their cues from us. But the bystander effect is not inevitable. Later studies showed that the effect weakens when the emergency is clear, or when people are directly asked for help. Specificity breaks the spell. If someone points at you and says, "You, in the red shirt, call for help," you are far more likely to act. Responsibility is no longer diffused. It's been assigned. This insight has been life-saving. Emergency response teams now train bystanders to give clear, direct instructions. You, dial this number. You, stay with them. The key is to pierce the fog of uncertainty with clarity. And yet, the psychological core remains deeply compelling. It's not that people are unkind. It's that kindness waits for permission. In a group, that permission is often delayed. The bystander effect reveals something fundamental about our nature, that doing nothing is rarely a deliberate decision. It's a slow drift, a moment lost to hesitation, a glance to others, a second that becomes too late. But it also offers hope, because when we become aware of this pattern, when we recognize it not as fate, but as a psychological reflex, we can interrupt it. Awareness is the antidote, and that brings us back to Kitty Genovese. Her story, though tragic, became a spark for social change. It led to the creation of the 911 emergency call system. It inspired countless studies, articles, books. It made the invisible dynamic of inaction visible, and in doing so, gave us the tools to respond better. Today, her name is more than a memory. It's a reminder that when you see something and you feel that familiar hesitation, that tug of someone else will handle it, you can pause and remember the voice you're waiting for might be your own. As you rest now, drifting into sleep, you may find yourself thinking of crowded streets, passing faces, silent choices. How often we are near others, yet unaware of what they need. How simple it can be to break the spell, with a word, a gesture, a glance that says, "I see you." And maybe that's the quiet truth hidden in the bystander effect, that even in a crowd, it only takes one person to shift the tide. Let it be you. The white coat hypnosis study. In the world of psychology, there are experiments that test the boundaries of behavior, memory, or emotion. But then there are others, quieter, subtler, that explore something even more elusive, the unseen influence of authority itself. This is the story of one such experiment. It didn't involve grand illusions or dramatic confessions. Instead, it involved a simple coat, a white coat, and the subtle, almost invisible power it seemed to carry. In the mid-1970s, researchers became increasingly curious about hypnosis, not just as a therapeutic tool, but as a psychological phenomenon. What made some people more responsive to it than others? Was it belief, suggestibility, or was something more primitive at play, something rooted not in technique, but in appearance? To test this, psychologists designed a curious study that would later be dubbed the white coat hypnosis experiment. Its premise was disarmingly simple. Two hypnotists were trained to deliver the exact same script, using the same tone, cadence, and instructions. Participants were randomly assigned to one of the two sessions. The only difference? One hypnotist wore everyday clothes, comfortable, casual, familiar. The other wore a crisp white lab coat, complete with a name tag and stethoscope. Everything else remained constant. The lighting, the room, the timing, even the chairs. The words spoken were identical, but the responses were anything but. Participants who were guided by the casually dressed hypnotist showed moderate responsiveness. Some entered a light trance. Others remained skeptical. A few giggled or questioned the process. But nothing unusual happened. In the other group, the change was immediate and profound. Those sitting across from the hypnotist in the white coat relaxed more quickly, followed instructions more easily, and entered deeper states of hypnosis. Some even displayed involuntary movements, raising their arms when asked, feeling imaginary warmth, responding emotionally to imagined scenarios. But here's where it became especially strange. When asked afterward why they had responded the way they did, many couldn't explain it. Some said, "He just seemed more professional." Others couldn't identify why they felt more trusting, more suggestible. They just did. The white coat, it seemed, was not just fabric, it was symbol. Over time, follow-up studies confirmed the effect. Variations were introduced. The coat, the presence of diplomas on the wall, the addition of a clipboard or a medical title, each layer increased the subject's compliance, even though nothing about the technique had changed. What the researchers uncovered was not just a hypnosis effect, it was an authority effect. The white coat, long associated with doctors, scientists, and healers, carried a quiet psychological weight. It whispered, "This person knows what they're doing. You can trust them. You can lower your guard." And the mind listened. This was consistent with a growing body of research in social psychology showing that humans are extraordinarily sensitive to signs of expertise and legitimacy. From uniforms to job titles to posture, we're wired to respond to hierarchy, even if we're unaware of it. It's a survival mechanism born in ancient times when choosing the right leader could mean life or death. Obedience to authority wasn't always blind faith. It was efficient, evolutionary, safe. But in modern times, this reflex can be quietly manipulated. As this study showed, someone appearing to be in charge, even without actual expertise, could influence behavior deeply, bypassing skepticism, inviting suggestion. This idea also echoed earlier findings from Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiments, where participants delivered what they believed were painful shocks to others, simply because an authority figure told them to. The white coat featured there too. But the hypnosis study added another layer. People weren't being ordered to do something unpleasant. They were voluntarily relaxing, opening up, choosing to be led. And yet, their ability to resist suggestion was still shaped, invisibly, by clothing and cues. One of the most haunting implications of this experiment is how often this dynamic plays out in daily life. When we hear someone on television wearing a suit, we tend to believe them. When a person speaks with confidence and expertise, we defer. When we see someone in a uniform, we rarely question their motives. Authority is often invisible not because it hides, but because it wears something familiar. And this raises uncomfortable questions. How often do we make decisions based not on logic, but on appearance? How many of our beliefs are quietly shaped by the roles others seem to play? The white coat hypnosis study may not have been as flashy as other psychological experiments. There were no shocking revelations, no trauma, no deception, just a coat, a tone, a suggestion. And yet it revealed one of the most powerful truths in human behavior. That influence doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through symbols. As you drift into sleep now, consider how much of the world is shaped not by force but by gentle nudges. A title, a badge, a suit, a name tag, and how often we follow those nudges without ever realizing we've been moved. The lesson is not to mistrust all symbols, but to recognize their power. Because if a coat can deepen a hypnotic trance, imagine what else it can do. Not just in therapy rooms, but in courtrooms, in hospitals, in boardrooms, in politics, and in our own minds. As the world fades softly into dreams, the quiet truth remains. Authority often enters not through force, but through familiarity. And once it's inside, it speaks not to your reason, but to something older, something deeper, something that only opens its eyes when you know what to look for. The forged letters experiment. In the soft shadows of psychological research, there exists a study that doesn't use elaborate machines or strange illusions, but something more delicate, our sense of fairness, of morality, of judgment. It was the early 1960s, a time when psychology was increasingly drawn to the subtle edges of thought. One researcher, Stanley Milgram, already well known for his later studies on obedience, conducted an experiment not about action, but about perception. Not about what people do, but how they judge others, and how easily that judgment can be manipulated. The study would later become known quietly as the forged letters experiment. Here's how it worked. Milgram recruited a group of university students under the premise that they would be participating in a study on evaluative judgment. Each student was presented with a stack of personal letters, 25 in total. Each one appeared to be a final note written by someone who had, allegedly, made a dramatic and irreversible decision. But here was the twist. Some of the letters were real, written with raw emotion and clarity. Others were fabricated by Milgram's team, carefully forged, crafted to seem genuine, but with subtle planted clues that would, if detected, reveal them as inauthentic. The participants were asked to read each letter and rate how authentic they felt it was, how real, how sincere. But that was just the surface. The real question was, how would the participants feel when they were told the truth? Because after the task was complete, Milgram did something unusual. He revealed the deception. He told the students that many of the letters were fakes, written by researchers, not real people. And he asked the students how they felt about having read and judged them. Some were shocked, others were quiet, a few were visibly unsettled. And then came the deeper layer. Milgram explained that the study wasn't about the letters themselves. It was about them, the readers. It was about how we make judgments based on emotion, tone, assumptions. How we assign truth or falsehood based not on objective evidence, but on subtle cues, on language, on how something feels. In other words, our perception of truth is often just that, a perception. What the forged letters experiment exposed was our deep vulnerability to suggestion. The students believed they could tell which notes were real and which were fake. Some were confident, but the results showed otherwise. People often misjudged. They rated some of the fabricated letters as deeply authentic, while dismissing real ones as contrived. The illusion of accuracy had been shattered, but the emotional impact didn't stop there. Many students expressed guilt, not because they had made errors, but because they had judged people at all. They had looked at something deeply personal and made cold evaluations, assigning numbers to emotional pain. And now, knowing that some of those letters had been genuine, they were left to wonder, what if I dismiss something real? What does that say about me? This internal conflict is what Milgram was truly interested in. He was probing the space between perception and morality, between belief and responsibility, between detachment and empathy. Because what this experiment really reveals is how fragile our sense of certainty is, how quickly it can be bent by suggestion, and how easily we can become overconfident in our moral radar. We think we know when someone is sincere. We believe we can spot lies. But in reality, we're reading shadows, interpreting tone, cadence, punctuation, emotion, and often we get it wrong. The forged letters experiment is a reminder of how difficult it is to truly understand another person's inner world, especially when we try to do so quickly, from a distance, through fragments. It also reveals something else, something quieter, that even in academic settings, when we are asked to analyze others, we are not detached observers. We carry our emotions into every judgment. We are moved by vulnerability. We are stirred by sadness. We are conflicted by our own discomfort. And when those feelings are turned back on us, when we realize that what we thought we saw might not have been true, the mirror becomes difficult to face. Milgram's study doesn't offer easy answers. It doesn't tell us how to improve our empathy or sharpen our accuracy. It simply invites us to pause, to acknowledge that judgment is rarely neutral, that perception is a dance between what's there and what we think is there. As you lay now in the stillness of rest, let this story settle like quiet dust. Think of how many letters, messages, glances, and words you interpret each day. How many times you've guessed at someone's truth, and how rarely you know for sure. In a world of endless signals, the greatest wisdom may be found not in certainty, but in humility. To see and to say, I don't know for sure, but I care enough to wonder. The Eichmann Experiment. There are moments in psychological history that don't just reveal something about the mind, they disturb it. They sit uncomfortably in our memory, not because of what they show about others, but because of what they imply about us, what we're capable of, what we might do. Not in rage or hatred, but in silence, with permission. This is the story of one of the most unsettling experiments ever conducted in social science. Known officially as the Milgram Obedience Study, It was nicknamed by some as the Eichmann Experiment, for reasons that will soon become clear. The year was 1961. The world was still reeling from the aftermath of World War II. The Nuremberg trials had already passed, but a new event seized global attention: the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Eichmann had been a key organizer of mass deportations. When captured and questioned, he didn't present himself as a fanatic, a sadist, or even a zealot. He seemed ordinary, reserved, bureaucratic. He claimed he had simply followed orders. The phrase echoed across newsrooms and courtrooms. "I was just doing my job." Stanley Milgram, a young psychologist at Yale University, was haunted by that phrase, not because he thought it was a good excuse, but because it sounded so familiar. What if obedience wasn't just a convenient defense? What if it was something deeply ingrained in all of us? Not because we are evil, but because we are wired to follow those we perceive as authority figures? To answer that, he designed an experiment unlike any other. Milgram recruited ordinary people, men from various walks of life: teachers, salesmen, postal workers. They were told they'd be participating in a study on learning and memory. They would play the role of the teacher, delivering a series of increasingly strong electric shocks to a learner in another room each time the learner made a mistake on a memory task. What the participants didn't know was this: the learner wasn't actually receiving shocks. He was an actor. And the true subject of the experiment was not the learner at all, but the teacher. Because Milgram wasn't interested in how well people learn. He wanted to know, how far would someone go when instructed by an authority figure to inflict pain on another person? The setup was simple, almost sterile. The participant sat at a control panel with switches labeled with voltages ranging from 15 volts, slight shock, all the way up to 450 volts. XXX. A man in a white lab coat stood beside the participant, calmly instructing them to continue. As the supposed shocks increased, the actor began to react, first with mild complaints, then with cries of pain. Eventually, he pounded on the wall. He begged to be released. He screamed about his heart, and finally, he fell silent. What would you do? Most people, when asked hypothetically, say they would stop. They would never go all the way. They would never follow orders that harmed another person. But that's not what happened. In the actual experiment, more than 65% of participants continued to the very end, delivering what they believed were lethal shocks, simply because the man in the lab coat told them to. They hesitated. They sweated. They trembled. Some laughed nervously. Others asked again and again, "Are you sure? Should I keep going?" And each time the authority figure responded with a simple phrase: "Please continue." The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. And so they did, not because they wanted to cause pain, not because they were cruel, but because the responsibility in their minds had been handed off. It didn't feel like their decision. It felt like following procedure. This, Milgram realized, was the core of the problem. People don't need to believe in violence to participate in it. They only need to believe they aren't the one making the choice. That's what made Eichmann so disturbing. He didn't seem monstrous. He seemed like a middle manager, a man who filled out forms, approved train routes, followed instructions, and yet his actions contributed to one of the darkest chapters in human history. Milgram's experiment showed that you don't need hatred to create horror. All you need is obedience. And this wasn't a one-time event. The experiment was repeated dozens of times with different variations. The results remained consistent, even when the participants were women, or when they sat in the same room as the learner. The same quiet pressure, the same tension, the same reluctant compliance. Milgram himself was shaken by the results. He didn't expect so many to go so far. He later wrote, "The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study and the fact most urgently demanding explanation." But the explanation, perhaps, lies in something even deeper. From childhood, we are taught to obey, to listen to teachers, parents, police, supervisors. We learn that authority is order and order is safety. Most of the time, this is good. It keeps society functioning. But there's a shadow side. When obedience becomes blind, when it overrides personal conscience, it opens the door to quiet complicity, not with villains, but with systems. And this is why Milgram's experiment remains so relevant, because it reminds us that evil doesn't always arrive with a scowl or a weapon. Sometimes it wears a white coat, speaks calmly, asks you to flip a switch. It's ordinary people in extraordinary situations who make the difference. So what can we take from this as you drift towards sleep? Perhaps a simple truth, that awareness is a kind of resistance, that knowing the patterns of influence, the gentle pressure of authority, the tendency to defer, the impulse to comply, can help us catch ourselves in the moment, to pause, to ask, is this right or just required? Milgram didn't conduct the Eichmann experiment to shame or to frighten. He did it to illuminate a quiet corner of the human psyche, one that prefers comfort to confrontation, roles to responsibility. But it's in that quiet space, between instruction and action, where morality lives. And sometimes saying no is the bravest thing an ordinary person can do. The strange situation. Sometimes the most profound truths about the human mind are not revealed in words, but in glances. In the way a child reaches for a mother, in the pause between crying and comfort, in the doorway between presence and absence. This is the story of one such doorway. It's called the strange situation, a quiet, carefully choreographed, psychological experiment designed not to test memory or logic, but something much softer, much older, something embedded in us before we can speak. It was the 1970s. In a small, sparsely furnished observation room at the University of Maryland, developmental psychologist Mary Ainsworth was preparing to answer one of the most delicate questions in psychology. How do children form bonds? And more importantly, how do those bonds shape the way we relate to the world? Ainsworth had already spent years observing children and their mothers in Uganda. She noticed something that many psychologists had missed. It wasn't just what mothers did, but how consistently they did it. Some children seemed calm and resilient, even in uncertainty. Others were clingy, fearful, or emotionally distant. She believed the key to understanding these patterns lay in something called attachment, the emotional glue that binds infants to their caregivers. But how could you measure something so invisible? She designed an experiment to find out. The strange situation was deceptively simple. It involved a mother, her infant, usually around 1 year old, and a carefully structured series of events. First, mother and child enter a quiet playroom filled with toys. The child explores. Then a stranger enters. The mother leaves. The child is left alone. Then the mother returns. Then leaves again. Then returns once more. Each transition, the entrance, the exit, the reunion, was designed to activate the child's attachment system, to create mild stress, not to frighten, but to reveal. The question wasn't whether the child would cry. Most did. The question was how they responded to separation, and more importantly, how they responded to reunion. Some children, when their mothers returned, would crawl into her arms and quickly calm down. They trusted that she would return. They used her as a secure base from which to explore the world. This pattern was called secure attachment. Others reacted very differently. Some seemed indifferent to their mother's absence. They played calmly when she was gone and ignored her return. But their heart rates told another story. They were anxious beneath the surface. This was avoidant attachment, a kind of emotional shutdown, a learned response to inconsistent care. Some children became overwhelmed when their mother left, and even more distressed when she returned. They cried, clung, and sometimes even pushed her away. Their emotions were tangled, chaotic. This was called ambivalent attachment, a deep desire for closeness mixed with fear of abandonment. And a few children displayed disorganized responses. They froze. They approached, but then backed away. Their movements seemed conflicted, uncertain. This, Ainsworth believed, was the result of confusion, when the caregiver was both a source of comfort and fear. These categories were not labels. They were windows. Each child's reaction told a silent story about their first relationships, about how safe the world felt, about how reliable comfort had been, and perhaps about how they would one day love, trust, and cope with loss. Over the decades, the strange situation became one of the most replicated and respected experiments in developmental psychology. Its findings were subtle but powerful. It showed that our earliest interactions, not dramatic traumas but everyday patterns, shape the blueprint for emotional life. Securely attached children often grow into adults who form healthy relationships, regulate their emotions, and cope with stress. Insecure attachment, on the other hand, can lead to difficulty trusting others, emotional volatility, or fear of closeness. And yet attachment styles are not destinies, they are not flaws, they are adaptations. Each pattern, secure, avoidant, ambivalent, disorganized, emerges as a way to survive emotionally in a specific environment. A child who doesn't receive comfort may learn not to seek it. A child who receives inconsistent love may cling, hoping not to lose it again. The brilliance of Ainsworth's work was that it treated even the most painful behaviors with compassion. She didn't pathologize, she listened, and in doing so, she helped us understand something that had long been hidden in plain sight, that the way we respond to others is often a reflection of how others first responded to us. Even now, as you lie in the softness of night, your body remembers patterns that began long before you could name them. The way you reach for comfort, the way you pull away when it feels too close, the way your heart responds to silence, or your mind tenses when someone leaves the room. These patterns are not mistakes, they are echoes. The strange situation tells us that emotional bonds are not abstract ideas. They are real, physical, measurable. They shape not only how we love, but how we explore, how we take risks, how we return home. It's called a strange situation because it was designed to feel unfamiliar to the child. But in truth, its strangeness lies in what it reveals to us. That even in infancy, we are already learning how to cope with absence, how to repair after rupture, how to trust that what leaves might come back. And if it doesn't, we learn how to keep going anyway. The beauty of attachment theory is that it doesn't end in childhood. Our patterns can shift, love can heal, trust can be rebuilt. The nervous system, once shaped by stress, can find safety in new connections. So as you breathe deeply now, perhaps think not only of the child in the playroom, looking for their mother, but of the adult within you, still seeking the same thing. Security, connection, presence, and the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful healing doesn't come from avoiding strange situations, but from learning to be less afraid of them. Because every return is a beginning, and every attachment, when nurtured, becomes a place to rest. The Daryl Bem ESP Studies. In the quiet rooms of academia, few things stir controversy like the suggestion that the mind might reach beyond itself, that it might sense events before they happen. That time may not be quite so linear, at least not inside consciousness. This is the story of a man who dared to ask such questions, not from the fringes of pseudoscience, but from within the halls of a respected university. His name was Daryl Bem, a social psychologist at Cornell. He was not a mystic, not a magician. He was known for his thoughtful experiments on self-perception and social behavior. And yet, in the final chapters of his academic career, he turned his attention to something more provocative, ESP, extrasensory perception, the possibility that people might unconsciously anticipate events before they occur. Not read minds, not predict lottery numbers, but simply respond to future stimuli as if they already sensed it coming. For decades, mainstream psychology had largely dismissed such claims as wishful thinking or flawed statistics. The idea that information could travel backward through time, defying causality, was not just controversial, it was taboo. But Daryl Bem had a different approach. He didn't promise magic, he didn't rely on anecdote. Instead, he applied rigorous experimental methods, the same methods used in memory and cognition studies. He believed that if ESP was real, it should be testable, measurable, statistical. So he set out to design an experiment, and then 9 more. In 2011, Bem published a paper in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, one of the most prestigious journals in the field. The title, Feeling the Future, experimental evidence for anomalous, retroactive influences on cognition and affect. It landed like a thunderclap. The premise was astonishing, but the experiments themselves were surprisingly simple. In one study, participants were shown a screen with two curtains. Behind one, a picture would appear, either neutral or sometimes emotionally charged. They were asked to guess which curtain hid the image. But here's the twist. The image wasn't chosen until after the participant made their guess. Using a random algorithm, the computer selected the location after the decision had been made. And yet participants guessed correctly more often than chance would predict, especially when the images were emotionally arousing. In other studies, participants were shown a list of words to memorize. Later, they were asked to recall as many as they could. Then, after this recall phase, they were randomly assigned certain words from the list to rehearse. The astonishing result? Participants were more likely to have remembered the words they would later practice, even though, at the time of recall, they hadn't yet seen them again. It was as if memory could echo backward in time. Bem conducted 9 such studies, all following standard statistical procedures. Across the board, the results suggested a small but consistent effect. Participants' minds seemed to respond to future events before those events occurred. To the public, it was mesmerizing. To many psychologists, it was maddening. How could this be? Bem wasn't the first to study psi phenomena, but he was the first to do it with this level of methodological rigor within the walls of mainstream science. His paper passed peer review. His statistics were transparent. The editorial board accepted it. And yet, the backlash was immediate. Skeptics argued that if such a result was possible, it would overturn not only psychology, but physics itself. They said the findings must be flawed. They questioned the statistics, the randomization, the interpretations. But others asked a different question. If the methodology was solid, and it matched methods used in countless other psychological studies, then why were we only rejecting the result because we didn't like what it implied? In that sense, the Daryl Bem ESP studies became more than experiments. They became a mirror, not for the paranormal, but for science itself. What do we do when data contradicts our expectations? When belief and evidence pull in opposite directions? Do we dismiss the data? Or do we allow ourselves to be curious, even when uncomfortable? Bem welcomed replication. He published all his methods openly. Some follow-up studies failed to reproduce the effect. Others claimed success. Meta-analyses produced mixed results. But perhaps that was the point all along. The studies forced psychology to confront a quiet assumption that the future can't influence the present, that time flows only forward, that cause must precede effect. And yet, in the microcosm of the human mind, perhaps things are not so simple. We know, after all, that the brain is not a passive recorder of reality. It's an active predictor. It fills in gaps. It anticipates. It simulates. You don't just see a scene, you generate it in real time. You don't just remember, you recreate. Could it be that consciousness is more fluid than we think? Even if the effect Bem observed wasn't paranormal, it might still reveal something strange and real, that the human brain is constantly scanning not just the present moment, but the probability field of what comes next. That the unconscious mind is not chained to the now, but moving slightly ahead, pre-sensing, pre-feeling, that before you act, before you speak, before you know, your mind may already be preparing. That's not magic. That's evolution. And if that's true, then maybe Bem's studies weren't about ESP at all. Maybe they were about intuition, about the quiet, invisible edge between decision and awareness, about how we sometimes just know before we know why, how we can walk into a room and sense the tension, or think of someone moments before they call. Coincidence? Pattern recognition? Or something else entirely? The answer may never be final, but in a way, that's what makes these studies so beautiful. They invite you to wonder, to sit quietly at the edge of sleep and ask, what if the boundaries between past and future are thinner than they seem? What if time, like thought, can ripple in both directions? What if the mind knows more than we think? And what if that knowing doesn't always wait for proof? The invisible gorilla experiment. Sometimes the most astonishing thing isn't what we see, it's what we fail to see. even when it's standing right in front of us. In the world of cognitive psychology, there is one experiment that has become legendary, not because it revealed something about memory or decision-making, but because it exposed a quiet illusion that shapes how we experience the world every day. It's called the invisible gorilla experiment. And once you understand it, you may never trust your eyes or your attention the same way again. The year was 1999. Psychologists Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons wanted to test something that had long been assumed but rarely demonstrated so vividly: the limits of human attention. They weren't studying intelligence or vision or even distraction. They were exploring a concept known as inattentional blindness, the failure to notice something fully visible when your mind is focused elsewhere. To demonstrate this, they created a short video. It seems straightforward. Two teams of people, one in white shirts, one in black, pass a basketball back and forth. The viewer's task was simple: count how many times the players in white pass the ball. That's it. Just focus. Count carefully. Most viewers concentrate intensely. They watch the video once, twice, sometimes 3 times. Then they give their answer, usually around 15 passes. And then the question comes, did you see the gorilla? Most people laugh, confused. Gorilla? They rewind the video. And there it is. Halfway through the clip, a person in a full gorilla suit walks calmly into the middle of the screen, stops, pounds their chest, and then exits, in plain view, for 9 full seconds. Yet in study after study, more than half of viewers completely miss it. They were so focused on the ball, on the task, on getting the count right, that they failed to notice something utterly unexpected. This became known as the invisible gorilla phenomenon, and it quickly entered the cultural lexicon. It was funny, surprising, almost unbelievable. But beneath the humor was something deeper. The experiment revealed a profound truth about perception. We don't see everything. We see what we're looking for. Our brains are not cameras. They don't record every detail of reality. Instead, they filter, select, prioritize. Attention is a spotlight, not a floodlight. And when that spotlight is fixed on one thing, everything else fades into the background, even something as absurd and obvious as a gorilla. Chabris and Simons had uncovered not a flaw, but a feature of the human mind, a survival mechanism. Our ancestors couldn't afford to process every leaf, every sound, every flicker of light. They had to focus on movement in the grass, on prey, on danger. Attention kept them alive. But in modern life, this same mechanism means that we miss more than we think. And not just gorillas, we miss signs, signals, faces, words, emotions. We fail to notice the friend who seems off, the red flag in a conversation, the quiet sadness behind a smile. We walk past beauty, past warning, past truth, because we are looking elsewhere. The invisible gorilla experiment teaches us a powerful psychological lesson. What we attend to shapes our reality. It doesn't just determine what we see, it determines what we don't see. This has implications far beyond a classroom video. In law enforcement, eyewitnesses may confidently recount events, only to realize later they missed crucial details. In driving, people can look directly at a pedestrian and still not register their presence. In medicine, a clinician may overlook a diagnosis because their mind is anchored on another. Even in daily life, inattentional blindness guides our experience. Think of all the times you've lost your keys, only to find them in plain sight, or listen to someone speak, but realized you haven't heard a word. You were there, but your attention wasn't. Yet there's another quieter message in the gorilla study. It's this: awareness is fragile, and that's not something to fear, but to respect. The experiment doesn't accuse you of being careless. It invites you to be curious, to slow down, to wonder what gorillas might be passing through your life, unseen, not because you're blind, but because you're focused. And in that awareness, something shifts. You begin to notice the background, the subtleties, the emotions between the words, the beauty between the moments. You begin to soften your spotlight just a little. That's where mindfulness lives, in the widening of attention, in the decision to not just look, but see. As you drift now into the softness of sleep, Perhaps you'll reflect on the hidden gorillas in your own world, the things you might be missing because you're counting something else. Not because you're failing, but because you're human. And in being human, you carry a fragile, remarkable gift, the ability to choose what you see, to focus, to notice, to widen your view when it matters most. Reality isn't always what's in front of you. It's what your mind allows in. And sometimes the most important truths are the ones dancing through your life, unnoticed for now, until you're ready to see them. The Demon Possession Study. In the dim corridors of psychological inquiry, few topics evoke such ancient fear and fascination as the idea of possession, not just as a cinematic trope, but as a cross-cultural phenomenon that stretches back through centuries of ritual, religion, and myth. This is the story of a study that dared to peer into that shadow, not to ask if possession is real, but rather, what does it mean when someone believes they are possessed? What happens when culture, trauma, and the mind collide? Psychologists had long been aware that in many parts of the world, strange behaviors, sudden voice changes, violent thrashing, speaking in unknown tongues, were not labeled as psychiatric symptoms, but as signs of something else. Spirit intrusion, supernatural influence, demonic possession. And so in the late 20th century, researchers from several universities across Europe, the US, and Africa collaborated on what came to be known, unofficially, as the Demon Possession Study. Its formal name was more clinical, the Cross-Cultural Study on Dissociation and Cultural Explanations of Altered States. But its heart was deeply human. The researchers traveled to villages in West Africa, tribal regions of Indonesia, churches in Brazil, and rural communities in the southern United States. Their goal was not to disprove belief, but to observe, to listen, to understand how deeply culture shapes the way we interpret behavior. They interviewed shamans, pastors, traditional healers, and local doctors. They observed exorcisms and healing ceremonies, and in each case they asked a simple but powerful question. When someone begins to act in ways that defy understanding, what do you believe is happening? The answers varied. In some regions, it was believed that spirits of ancestors were visiting, in others that a curse had taken hold. In evangelical communities, the explanation often pointed to a moral struggle between light and darkness, and in still other places, the behavior was seen as a gift, the calling of a future healer. The symptoms, however, were often remarkably consistent. Sudden shifts in identity, loss of memory, speaking in voices that were not one's own, convulsions, trance-like states, physical strength beyond explanation, fear, relief, collapse. In Western psychiatry, these would often be categorized under dissociative disorders, episodes where the mind detaches from normal awareness, often triggered by stress or trauma. But what the Demon Possession Study revealed was that the meaning of those symptoms was entirely shaped by belief. In cultures where possession was seen as spiritual, the afflicted person was cared for in ritual. They were not rejected. They were surrounded by community. Often, after the episode passed, they reported feeling lighter, relieved, transformed. In cultures where such behavior was stigmatized, the outcome was different. People who believed they were possessed often felt shame, isolation, fear, and their symptoms persisted longer. This finding, quiet but profound, suggested that the experience of possession is not only psychological, but deeply contextual. What the mind interprets depends on the stories it has been given. The researchers found that many so-called possession episodes correlated with past emotional trauma, especially in childhood. But instead of expressing that trauma as anxiety or depression, the individuals embodied it in culturally recognizable forms: spirit possession, trance, or exorcism. The mind, it seems, uses the language it has. A person growing up in a village steeped in animism may express distress as spirit intrusion. A person raised in a strict religious environment may experience it as demonic. A person in the West may develop symptoms resembling dissociative identity disorder, but underneath the surface, the pain is often the same: a history of loss, abuse, fear, or deep internal conflict. The Demon Possession Study didn't set out to invalidate belief. In fact, it treated all explanations, spiritual and psychological, as worthy of study. What it highlighted was the profound adaptability of the human mind. Our inner experiences don't exist in a vacuum. They are shaped, mirrored, and even amplified by the world around us. If we are taught to see possession as evil, then it becomes terrifying. If we are taught to see it as sacred, then it becomes transformational. And in both cases, the body responds accordingly. The study also touched on another curious idea, that ritual can be healing, even if its mechanisms are symbolic. In many communities, exorcisms or spirit-cleansing ceremonies led to real, lasting improvement. Not because of supernatural forces necessarily, but because the person was seen, held, and given a narrative that made sense of their suffering. In this way, belief itself became medicine. The mind, given a structure for release, often accepted the healing. So what do we learn from this? Perhaps something quietly radical, that what we call madness may sometimes be misunderstood meaning. That the strange behaviors we fear might be old survival strategies, given shape by story, and that to truly understand the mind, we must also understand the myths that surround it. Even now, as you lie in the quiet safety of sleep, your mind carries echoes of your own culture's stories about right and wrong, sanity and strangeness, light and shadow. We are all shaped by what we believe is possible. The demon possession study reminds us that the boundary between science and spirit, illness and myth, is not always as rigid as we think. Sometimes what seems supernatural is simply the psyche crying out in a language we've forgotten how to read. And perhaps the most powerful healing doesn't come from erasing those stories, but from listening to them more deeply. Because the mind doesn't just want to be cured, it wants to be understood. The rat park experiment. Addiction is often imagined as a chemical hook, something buried in a substance that hijacks the brain, seizing control from within. Once it takes hold, it's said, the person is powerless to resist. But what if that story is incomplete? What if addiction is not only about chemicals, but about connection? This is the quiet, powerful question at the heart of one of psychology's most overlooked and misunderstood studies. The rat park experiment, conducted in the late 1970s by Canadian psychologist Bruce K. Alexander and his colleagues at Simon Fraser University. At the time, the dominant view of addiction was simple. Substances like morphine or cocaine were inherently addictive. If you gave a rat access to the drug, it would consume more and more, often to the point of death. That belief came from studies in which rats were placed alone in small cages, with two levers, one for water, the other for drug-laced water. The result? The rats overwhelmingly chose the drugged water. They drank it obsessively. They stopped eating. Some overdosed. And so the conclusion seemed obvious. Drugs cause addiction. But Bruce Alexander wasn't convinced. He noticed something others had overlooked, not in the results, but in the setting. The rats in these studies were isolated, alone. No toys, no other rats. Nothing to do but press a lever. What if the problem wasn't the drug, but the cage? To test this idea, he built a radically different environment, a place he called Rat Park. Rat Park was a spacious enclosure, 200 times larger than the standard lab cage. It was filled with things rats naturally enjoy: wheels to run on, tunnels to explore, nesting materials, and, most importantly, other rats to play with, mate with, and interact with. Then Alexander gave them the same two options: plain water or morphine-laced water. What happened next would challenge decades of assumptions. The rats in standard cages still consumed the drugged water in large amounts. But the rats in Rat Park, they showed minimal interest in the morphine. They tried it, they tasted it, but they overwhelmingly preferred the plain water. Even when the morphine water was sweetened to make it more appealing, they chose not to indulge. They were too busy living, too engaged, too connected, too stimulated by their environment to be captivated by a chemical escape. And when rats that had been kept in isolation and had developed a drug habit were moved into Rat Park, something remarkable happened. Many of them stopped using the drugged water altogether. Not through punishment, not through intervention, but through a change in environment. It was a quiet revolution. The experiment suggested that addiction might not be simply about exposure to chemicals, but about the absence of connection, that the root of compulsive behavior could lie in social isolation, emotional deprivation, and the lack of meaningful alternatives. The implications were enormous. If addiction was less about the substance and more about the context, then treatment might need to focus not just on detoxification, but on reconnection to people, purpose, play, and place. But at the time, the scientific community wasn't ready for this. The rat park experiment was largely ignored. It didn't fit the prevailing narrative. Funding agencies didn't follow up. Mainstream journals declined to amplify it, and for years it remained in the margins of addiction science. But decades later, its insights began to resurface. New research in humans echoed what Alexander saw in rats. Studies showed that loneliness, trauma, and social disconnection are powerful predictors of substance misuse, that people in supportive communities are less likely to develop addictions. That recovery is more successful when relationships are repaired, not just receptors. And suddenly, Rat Park didn't seem so radical. It seemed obvious, and perhaps quietly tragic, because it had taken us so long to listen. So what does this mean for us? For you? It means that the opposite of addiction may not be sobriety, it may be connection. It means that healing doesn't always come from cutting something out, but from bringing something in, belonging, safety, engagement, joy. And perhaps most of all, it means that when someone is struggling, we must look not only at what they're using, but at what they're missing. Bruce Alexander's rats remind us that the mind is not just a biological machine, but a social organism. We are wired to bond. And when we cannot bond with others, we may try to bond with substances, with rituals, with screens, with anything that offers comfort. But deep down, what we're often seeking isn't intoxication. It's relief from isolation. So as you lie now in the stillness of your own quiet enclosure, perhaps reflect gently on the cage and the park within your own life. What nourishes you? What confines you? And what connections might restore your sense of aliveness? Because addiction is not always loud. Sometimes it's the whisper of unmet needs, of quiet despair, of cages built from routine, or grief, or silence. But even in those moments, the possibility of Rat Park remains. The possibility of turning towards something richer, something warmer, something real. And in that turn, we may rediscover the most healing substance of all, belonging. The Monster Face Study. There are fears that live on the surface, sharp, sudden jolts of surprise. And then there are fears that whisper beneath awareness. The ones we can't name, but still feel. The ones that shape how we see the world and each other. This is the story of a psychological experiment that peered into that quiet space between vision and emotion. A study that didn't just ask what we see, but how deeply our fear distorts the face of others. It came to be known informally as the Monster Face Study. In reality, the study was about facial recognition and emotion processing, a subtle investigation into how we react to ambiguity and how the brain fills in the blanks. The experiment was designed by neuroscientists exploring the intersection of fear, perception, and the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system. They wanted to understand how people interpret faces when they're not sure what they're looking at, how the mind colors the unknown. Participants were shown a rapid sequence of morphed faces, images that slowly transitioned from one expression to another, from calm to angry, from happy to fearful, from human to distorted. Some of the faces were subtly altered, slightly exaggerated eyes, elongated features, mouths that were just a bit too wide. Not overtly terrifying, just strange. Each image was shown for less than a second. Participants were asked to categorize what they saw. Was it angry, neutral, trustworthy, threatening, human? Most people didn't realize it, but the faces weren't random. They were designed to exist on the edge of recognition, somewhere between familiar and foreign, between a neighbor and a nightmare. What the researchers found was remarkable. When people were uncertain, when the face was ambiguous or flashed quickly, their minds often defaulted to fear. They labeled neutral faces as suspicious, slightly altered faces as aggressive. In other words, the brain, when unsure, leans toward caution. It invents monsters, and it does so without our permission. This wasn't about paranoia or irrationality. It was about survival. For thousands of years, our ancestors needed to detect threat before it was obvious. A rustle in the grass, a flicker of movement, a stranger's glance. Better to overreact than underprepare. And so, buried deep in the brain, our emotional circuits evolved a quiet bias. When in doubt, fear. In this way, the monster face study wasn't about monsters at all. It was about how the mind projects threat onto ambiguity. And it doesn't just happen with faces. It happens in crowds, in silence, in relationships, in news headlines. We see someone unfamiliar and our brain begins to fill in the missing pieces. Are they safe? Are they judging me? Are they angry? And without clear answers, the fear creeps in. Not because they are dangerous, but because the mind needs certainty, and fear is a quick substitute. The study also revealed something else, something quieter and more human. When the same participants were given a little more time to view the faces, just a second longer, their interpretations softened. The monsters faded. The distortions lost their edge. What once seemed hostile now seemed unsure, vulnerable, even kind. The implication was profound. Fear shrinks with attention. When we pause, when we look again, when we give our mind space to reprocess what it assumed, it often changes its answer. The same is true in life. That stranger who seemed cold might just be shy. That face you thought was angry might be tired. That tension in the room might be your own projection. So much of what we fear is made of shadows cast by our own uncertainty. And in that way, the monster face study became a metaphor, not just for perception, but for empathy. It showed us that we are not passive observers. We don't simply see reality, we construct it. And when we look quickly, from a place of stress or bias, we often build a world that is more hostile than it really is. But when we slow down, when we breathe, when we give our nervous system space to recalibrate, we begin to see differently. The monster becomes a human again. Even now, as you drift into the soft quiet of sleep, your brain continues to process the faces of your day. It replays glances, frowns, smiles that may or may not have been meant for you. And perhaps it adds fear where there was only confusion. Perhaps it adds meaning where there was only motion. But you can gently remind yourself, not everything that feels threatening is real. Sometimes the mind sees monsters because it hasn't had time to see the truth. So let this be an invitation to slow your gaze, to stay with ambiguity a little longer, to trust that, more often than not, what we fear most in others is something we haven't yet understood. The monster face study doesn't tell us that fear is wrong, only that it is fast, and the truth is often slower. The visual neglect study. Close your eyes for a moment. Now imagine waking up one day and being unable to recognize the left half of your world. Not blind, not in darkness, but as if that side of reality no longer exists. You eat from one side of your plate and leave the other untouched because it doesn't feel like there's anything there. You shave only half your face, draw only half a clock, read only the right side of a sentence, and yet you don't feel as if anything is missing. This is the strange and haunting condition explored in what psychologists call the visual neglect study, a series of clinical observations and experiments that unlocked one of the most mysterious aspects of perception, that what we see is not always what's in front of us. It is what the brain chooses to let in. The condition is known as hemispatial neglect, a neurological syndrome often following a stroke in the right parietal lobe of the brain. The damage does not affect vision itself. The eyes function perfectly, but the attention, the awareness of one half of space is gone. And not just the physical space. Even in memory, even in imagination, the brain ignores one side. One of the most famous studies of this phenomenon was conducted in the 1980s in Italy, in the beautiful city of Milan. Neurologists asked patients with visual neglect to recall the Piazza del Duomo, a grand city square that many of them knew intimately. The participants were asked to sit and visualize the piazza from one end, describe the shops, the cathedral, the statues. They did, but they only described the right side of the square. Then the researchers asked the patients to imagine standing at the opposite end, facing the other direction, and describe the scene again. And suddenly they described the opposite buildings, the ones they had ignored the first time, not because they had remembered more, but because their mental attention had now shifted directions. The researchers realized something astonishing. Neglect wasn't just a problem with seeing. It was a problem with attention itself. The brain was editing reality, and the person had no idea. This discovery revealed something quietly unsettling about perception, that your world, the full richness of what you believe you're experiencing, is always being filtered, sculpted, trimmed, and you don't notice what's been left out. In later studies, patients were shown drawings like a daisy or a butterfly and asked to copy them. They did so perfectly. On the right half of the page, the left side was left blank. But when asked if the drawing looked complete, they said yes. They weren't lying. They genuinely could not detect what their brain had failed to represent. This is the heart of visual neglect, the absence of awareness about the absence itself, a blindness that hides even from the self. The implications go far beyond neurology, because while visual neglect is a medical condition, the phenomenon it reveals, that attention defines reality, is something that affects all of us. We may not have lesions in our parietal cortex, but we too neglect parts of our world every day, not out of illness, but out of habit. We focus on what we expect, on what we value, on what is loud or urgent or familiar. And without realizing it, we leave entire sides of life unexamined. The visual neglect study teaches us something profound, that attention is the gatekeeper of consciousness. What we don't attend to, we often don't know we're missing. This is true in how we see others, in how we engage with history, in how we remember ourselves. You may remember certain details of a day, but forget the background music, the color of the sky, the expression on someone's face. Not because you are forgetful, but because your mind was focused elsewhere. This kind of selective attention isn't a flaw. It's necessary. Without it, we would be overwhelmed by information. The brain must choose what to highlight. But the cost is that we often mistake that selection for reality itself. Neglect reminds us that what we see is a narrative, assembled in the quiet back rooms of the mind. And this has emotional consequences. People with visual neglect often don't feel distress. They aren't worried, because their sense of reality feels whole, even when it's fractured. Likewise, we may feel that our understanding of a person, a place, a memory is complete, even when entire pieces are missing. And unless we are shown otherwise, we may never realize it. But there is hope here too, because the brain is plastic, and with the right cues, awareness can be expanded. Some therapists use visual scanning training, encouraging patients to consciously turn their gaze toward the neglected side. And slowly, awareness returns. Not automatically, but through repetition, through attention. And this is a metaphor for growth in all of us. We don't need to fix every blind spot at once, but we can choose to turn our gaze, to ask, what am I not seeing? What part of this story have I ignored? What emotion lies just outside the edges of my awareness? Even now, as you lie in the soft quiet of night, your brain is filtering the world. You are noticing some thoughts and letting others pass unnoticed. You are dreaming on one side of the street while the other stays in shadow. But the beauty of being human is that we can move the light. We can reorient the beam of awareness. We can choose again and again to include what was once excluded. And perhaps that is the quiet invitation of the visual neglect study, to remember that perception is never final, that your world may be larger than you think, that what's missing may not be lost, only unseen, and that with a little patience, a little stillness, and a little courage to look again, even the neglected corners of the mind can come softly back into view. The two-faced doll experiment. Sometimes truth wears a soft face, and sometimes two. One smiling, one uncertain, and in between them, the quiet space where our minds make unconscious choices. This is the story of an experiment that used something as simple as a doll, a toy, a symbol of childhood, to reveal something far more complex: how early and how silently we learn to judge people by appearance. It has been called the two-faced doll experiment, though in research literature, it often appears under more formal titles. Studies of implicit bias in children, but the core idea remains the same. At the heart of this experiment is a simple scene: two dolls placed side by side, identical in size, shape, and expression, only one difference: their skin tone. One is lighter, one is darker. The child is then asked a series of questions. Which doll is pretty? Which one is bad? Which one is smart? Which one looks like you? These questions are asked gently, without pressure, in a calm, neutral setting. And yet the answers are never neutral. The original version of this study dates back to the 1940s. Psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark, African-American researchers working in the United States, designed the experiment to explore how children internalize social messages about race. They showed the dolls to both white and black children, and what they found was deeply unsettling. Across the board, children overwhelmingly favored the lighter doll. They said it was prettier, kinder, smarter. Even children who shared the skin tone of the darker doll sometimes pointed to the lighter one when asked, "Which one looks like you?" The Clarks concluded that racial bias was not just a social problem, it was a psychological inheritance, passed silently from one generation to the next. Children, without being explicitly told, had absorbed the values of their world. They had learned, through stories, through television, through subtle signals from adults, which faces were praised and which were ignored. And so they carried this knowledge inside them, not with hatred, but with the soft, unconscious weight of conditioning. When the Clarks published their findings, the world took notice. Their work was even cited in the landmark 1954 Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education, which declared racial segregation in schools unconstitutional. But the story doesn't end there. Decades later, researchers repeated the experiment. New countries, new contexts, different dolls, same questions, and again, similar results. Even in societies that claimed to be more open, more evolved, the bias lingered. Not in policy, perhaps, but in perception. Some studies found that children as young as 3 were already associating certain physical features, skin tone, facial structure, hair texture, with traits like intelligence, kindness, and beauty. This raised a quiet, unsettling question. How early do we begin to divide the world into us and them? And how much of that division happens below awareness? The two-faced doll experiment doesn't accuse children. It doesn't shame them. It reveals something far more important: that bias is not born, but built. And it is built from small things. From who is the hero in a bedtime story, from whose picture hangs in the classroom, from who gets complimented for being well-spoken, from which faces are praised in cartoons and which are used for villains. Children in their innocence don't yet know prejudice, but they do know patterns. They learn who gets smiles, who gets scolded, who gets seen, and over time those patterns become beliefs. Silent, automatic beliefs that shape how they treat others and how they see themselves. But there is another side to this story, a hopeful one, because just as children can learn bias, they can also unlearn it, and just as easily they can be taught inclusion, empathy, and truth. In follow-up studies, researchers found that when children were regularly exposed to diverse books, multicultural dolls, and inclusive role models, the bias diminished. When they were given stories where the hero looked different, when their teachers named the unspoken dynamics, when their toys looked like all kinds of people, the dolls told a different story, and the children listened. So what can we take from the two-faced doll experiment? Not shame, not guilt, but awareness. An awareness that perception is not neutral, that even the youngest among us are quietly learning what the world believes, and that it is our responsibility, all of us, to help write a different story. Even now, as you sink into the softness of rest, your mind may drift back to a time when you too held a doll, or looked at a face, or wondered who you were supposed to be, and perhaps in those moments you too were given silent messages about worth, about beauty, about belonging. But you can choose even now to reshape them, to reparent your perception, to imagine a shelf where all the dolls are heroes, where no face is neglected, where innocence is not quietly rewritten by bias. The two-faced doll experiment reminds us that our judgments don't begin with hate, they begin with habit. And the most powerful thing we can do for ourselves, for our children, is to gently, intentionally change the habit. The rubber hand illusion: reach out your hand. Feel the air brush your skin. Sense the weight of your fingers, the warmth of your palm, the quiet knowledge that this is you. But what if it isn't? What if your mind, so certain, so familiar, could be convinced that a rubber replica, lifeless and cold, is actually part of your body? This is the quiet wonder and strangeness at the center of a psychological phenomenon known as the rubber hand illusion. A simple setup, a plastic arm, and an experiment that reveals something breathtaking about the fragility of self-awareness. It began in the late 1990s with researchers Matthew Botvinnik and Jonathan Cohen at Princeton University. They wanted to explore a question that had fascinated philosophers and neuroscientists for centuries. What creates the feeling of ownership over the body? How do you know your hand is yours? They invited volunteers to sit at a table with their real left hand hidden behind a screen. In front of them, a rubber hand placed where their real hand would normally be. It was realistic, skin-colored, human-shaped, not threatening, not robotic, just there. Then something curious happened. The researcher began to stroke both the real hand and the rubber hand at the same time, in perfect synchrony. Same direction, same rhythm, same pressure, back and forth, gentle, predictable. And within minutes, sometimes less, participants began to experience something uncanny. They started to feel as if the rubber hand was their own, not just intellectually, viscerally. Some reported tingling, warmth, a sense of connection. If the rubber hand was suddenly injured, poked with a needle or hit with a hammer, the participants often flinched. Their bodies reacted with real fear to a fake threat. It was as if their brains had temporarily adopted the rubber limb as part of their identity. And yet their real hand, just centimeters away, still sat untouched. This was the rubber hand illusion, and it cracked open something astonishing: that your sense of self is not fixed. It is constructed, maintained, and, under the right conditions, rewired. The illusion showed that bodily ownership is built through sensory integration. What you see, what you feel, and what you expect. When vision and touch are synchronized, the brain prioritizes the visual cue, even if it's obviously artificial. It trusts the pattern more than the substance. But the implications go beyond the rubber hand. Variations of the experiment have extended to virtual hands, tools, even full-body illusions. In one version, participants wear VR goggles and see a stranger's body from a first-person perspective. After a few minutes of synchronized motion, they begin to feel as if that body is their own. And with that shift in perception comes a shift in emotion, in empathy, even in memory. The illusion teaches us something humbling: that our sense of I, of me, mine, and self, is deeply dependent on context. That the boundaries of the body are not as solid as we believe. And it raises fascinating questions. If the mind can adopt a rubber hand as its own, what else has it adopted? What parts of your identity, your self-image, your beliefs, your habits, have been absorbed not because they are true, but because they were synchronized with your experience? What hands in your life have become yours through repetition, familiarity, and the illusion of connection? This experiment quietly suggests that the self is not a static sculpture, but a moving illusion continuously shaped by perception. And yet, this is not a flaw. It's a gift. Because if the self is flexible, then it is also resilient, capable of transformation, capable of healing. People who lose limbs and experience phantom pain sometimes use mirror therapy, a process that mimics the rubber hand illusion, to retrain the brain, reduce suffering, and restore balance. And people with body dysphoria or disconnection from parts of their body may, Through similar techniques, learn to re-establish a sense of ownership and integration. The rubber hand illusion, strange as it may be, reminds us that the mind is willing to believe, if only the story feels real enough. Even now, as you lie in the calm safety of sleep, your brain is weaving sensations into identity. The position of your arms, the softness of the pillow, the stillness of the night, all contributing to that quiet sense of being here, being you. But even this self, this feeling of me, is a process, an illusion, a beautiful one, crafted moment by moment. So as you drift deeper, ask yourself not what is real, but what feels synchronized. What parts of you have been borrowed? What old rubber hands are still being claimed as your own? And what would it feel like to let them go? To remember that the self is not a fixed object, but a rhythm, a dance between sensation and meaning, a pulse of presence endlessly becoming. The rubber hand may not be real, but your experience of it is, and that's where the mystery begins. The chameleon effect. Imagine walking into a quiet room. You sit across from a stranger. You don't know them. You don't speak. And yet, within moments, you find your posture mirroring theirs. Your hands rest the same way. You blink at the same rhythm. You even start to breathe in sync. You didn't choose to do this. It just happened, as if some hidden part of you had leaned forward, curious and open, reaching not with words but with subtle imitation. This is the chameleon effect, and it reveals something beautiful and strange, that we are wired to become each other. The term was coined in 1999 by psychologists Tanya Chartrand and John Bargh, who were curious about an ancient question. Why do we unconsciously mimic the people around us? To explore this, they designed a series of experiments where participants interacted with a partner. Someone they believed was another participant, but was actually a trained actor following a script. Sometimes the actor rubbed their face, sometimes they tapped their foot, sometimes they smiled or crossed their arms in a certain way. The participants, unaware of the setup, were later filmed. And again, they mimicked the behaviors of the actor without realizing it. The results were consistent and striking. Even simple, meaningless gestures were unconsciously copied. And not just copied, but copied more often when the actor was warm, friendly, and engaging. This is the chameleon effect, our brain's quiet habit of mirroring others to create connection. It happens beneath language, beneath strategy, beneath awareness. It is empathy in motion, built into muscle memory, and it works both ways. When someone mimicked the participant, even subtly, those participants reported liking the person more. They felt more comfortable, more understood, even if no deep conversation had taken place. In other words, mimicry builds rapport. It signals, I see you, I understand you, I am like you. And that signal is powerful. Evolutionarily, this makes sense. For our ancestors, survival often depended on harmony. Groups that could sing together, hunt together, laugh together, grieve together, were more likely to survive. So the brain learned a silent language. Mirror others to bond, mirror to belong. But the chameleon effect is not just social, it's neurological. Brain scans reveal that when we observe someone performing an action, raising a hand, smiling, tilting their head, our brain activates mirror neurons, specialized cells that fire both when we do something and when we see someone else doing it. It's as if the brain is practicing the movement internally, as if it's whispering, I could be you. And in that whisper, we create connection. But there's another side too. The chameleon effect can sometimes backfire. If the mimicry is too obvious or forced, people feel uncomfortable. They sense insincerity. Authenticity matters. And some people, those with social anxiety or certain neurodivergent traits, may find this mimicry confusing, exhausting, or even absent altogether. So this isn't a rule, it's a tendency, a reflection of the brain's quiet longing for belonging. It's why yawns are contagious, why we laugh more in groups, why we feel uneasy around someone whose tone or posture doesn't quite match ours. We are always scanning, always syncing, even when we don't mean to. And not just with people. The rhythm of music, the pacing of speech, the editing of films, all pull us into emotional resonance. We don't just watch a story, we enter it. And perhaps, most of all, we mirror ourselves. The versions of us we've been around the longest. The habits we've repeated, the emotional patterns we've absorbed. Sometimes the you feel is not just you, but a collection of mirrored moments. Parents, friends, strangers, stories, all reflected in the way you move, speak, think. And in that realization, there is something tender, because it means we are not islands. We are, each of us, quiet echoes of one another, borrowing and lending pieces of self in every encounter. Even now, as you rest, your body remembers the rhythms of others, the gestures of those you loved, the way a friend tilted their head, the softness in someone's voice long ago. It lingers, inside muscle, inside memory. The chameleon effect reminds us we are shaped by presence, by proximity, by the warmth or tension in a room, and we too shape others, gently, invisibly, with our presence. So perhaps the question isn't, who am I copying? But rather, who do I allow to shape me? And what version of myself do I offer in return? In this light, every interaction becomes sacred, every smile a mirror, every silence a sync, every meeting a quiet choreography of becoming, not manipulation, not performance, but resonance. Because maybe we're not meant to be static. Maybe we're meant to adapt, to soften, to reflect. Like chameleons, not to disappear, but to belong. Split brain studies. You are one person, one self, one stream of thoughts, feelings, and memories. At least that's how it feels. But what if that unity is an illusion? What if, inside your skull, there are two minds, separate, silent, and unaware of each other? This is the strange, humbling revelation behind the split brain studies, a series of experiments that opened a quiet doorway into the divided architecture of the human mind. It began with patients, people suffering from extreme, unmanageable seizures. To save them, surgeons tried something radical. They severed the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerves connecting the brain's two hemispheres. The surgery was successful, the seizures stopped, and at first everything seemed normal. Patients could speak, walk, think, feel. They didn't feel split, they felt whole. But when researchers, most notably Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga, began to test these patients, they discovered something astonishing. Though the two hemispheres were still physically present, they were now unable to communicate. And under the right conditions, the mind split in two. To understand how, we must remember a basic fact of brain anatomy. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, processes language, and tends to be analytical. The right hemisphere controls the left side, handles spatial awareness, and is more emotional and intuitive. In most people, the two sides constantly share information. But in split brain patients, that bridge was gone. So researchers devised a way to speak to the hemispheres independently. They flashed images to either the left or right visual field, which sent the information to just one hemisphere. And then they asked questions. For example, if a word was flashed to the right visual field, processed by the left hemisphere, the patient could say what they saw: ball, key, tree. But if the word was shown to the left visual field, processed by the right hemisphere, they would say, I didn't see anything. And yet, when asked to point with their left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, they could correctly identify the object. One part of the brain knew the answer, the other didn't. But more curious still was what happened when the hemispheres disagreed. In one test, the right hemisphere was shown a scary image, like a burning house, while the left hemisphere saw nothing. When asked if they felt afraid, the patient said no. But when asked to choose a picture that matched how they felt, they picked the scary one. It was as if two separate selves were living under the same roof, each with its own perceptions, its own emotions, its own version of reality. And yet only one, the left hemisphere, could speak. That voice, the voice you hear in your head as you, is not the whole self. It is only the narrator. In fact, Gazzaniga discovered something even stranger. When the two hemispheres were given conflicting commands, the left hemisphere, the verbal one, would often invent a story to explain what had happened. It didn't say, "I don't know." It said, "Oh, I must have done that because," even when the reasoning made no sense. This led to the idea of the left brain interpreter, a storytelling machine that fills in gaps, even when it doesn't have the truth. It wants coherence more than accuracy. And so we arrive at a profound insight. The self is a narrative, a patchwork of thoughts stitched together into a story we believe is unified. But behind the curtain, it is more fragmented than we know. The split brain studies show us that the mind is not one voice, but many, some loud, some silent, some speaking in images, others in impulses, some asking questions, others answering before the question is even finished. It also invites compassion, because if your brain can hold multiple competing selves, maybe your moments of contradiction aren't flaws. Maybe they're symptoms of being plural inside. The part of you that wants to speak and the part that can't, the part that reaches and the part that turns away. Even in ordinary life, our hemispheres pull in different directions. You've felt it before? When logic says one thing, but instinct says another. When your words say, "I'm fine," but your body trembles. When you remember something clearly, but can't explain why it matters. The split brain studies whisper to us, this is not confusion. It is what it means to be human, to contain multitudes, to think in layers, to live with selves that do not always agree, but still manage to move forward together. Even now, as you rest, your brain continues its silent dialogue. Left and right, speech and sensation, reason and emotion. And perhaps in sleep, the walls between them soften, and the pieces come home. So as you drift deeper, let go of the need to feel whole. You are not broken because you are complex. You are not lost because your mind moves in different voices. You are a quiet orchestra, and the music is made in the space between. The Stockholm Syndrome case, there are certain stories the mind is not built to tell. Stories that don't fit cleanly into categories of logic, instinct, or emotion. Stories in which fear and loyalty walk hand in hand. This is one of them. It begins in Stockholm, Sweden, August 1973. A quiet bank morning turned into a psychological riddle that would puzzle researchers for decades. A man enters the Sveriges credit bank, armed and prepared. He takes 4 hostages, 3 women and 1 man, and holds them in the bank's vault for 6 days. During those 6 days, the outside world watches in horror. Police surround the building. Negotiators plead. The clock ticks. And yet, something unexpected begins to happen inside. The hostages do not grow more hostile toward their captor. Instead, they begin to form a bond with him. They worry for his safety. They try to protect him from the police. They resist rescue. Even after the standoff ends and the hostages are released, they refuse to testify against him. One of them later visits him in prison. Another raises money for his legal defense. The world is confused. Why would victims defend their abuser? Why would terror turn into trust? The answer, perhaps, is that trauma does not always follow the rules we expect. A criminologist studying the event coined the term we now know, Stockholm Syndrome. It describes a paradoxical phenomenon. When people who are threatened or abused begin to identify with their captor, to feel empathy, even affection, toward the very person who harmed them. And while the phrase became popular in media, its roots are far more complex than a headline. Psychologists soon discovered that this wasn't just about that one bank in Sweden. It was a pattern, quietly repeating itself across different situations. Hostages, abusive relationships, cults, war zones. Anywhere there was a stark imbalance of power, and the hope for survival depended, however irrationally, on staying close to the threat. To understand this, we must go deep into the human nervous system. When faced with extreme danger, the body has several responses: fight, flight, freeze. But there's another lesser-known response: fawn. Fawning is the mind's attempt to appease the threat, to survive by being agreeable, compliant, even caring. In situations of prolonged captivity, the brain begins to reorganize its reality. It reframes the captor not just as a threat, but as a potential protector. The logic goes like this. They could hurt me, but they haven't. Yet, they gave me food today. They looked me in the eye. They didn't yell this time. And slowly, this strange calculus becomes a lifeline. When all control is lost, even a small act of kindness from the captor, real or perceived, feels enormous. It creates a false sense of intimacy, a fragile connection that offers psychological refuge. This isn't weakness. It's not foolishness. It's adaptive. In a situation where escape seems impossible, the mind does the only thing it can. It rewrites the story to make it survivable. And so attachment is born, not from trust, but from terror. But the scars remain long after the danger ends. Survivors often struggle with shame. They ask themselves, why did I feel that way? Why didn't I run? Why did I defend them? But these questions carry the weight of misunderstanding. The Stockholm Syndrome case reminds us that human behavior is not always rational under pressure. The brain's primary task is not justice, it's survival. And sometimes surviving means confusing the jailer for a friend. Even now, decades later, researchers still debate whether Stockholm Syndrome is the best term. Some call it outdated. Others argue it pathologizes victims, making them appear complicit in their own suffering. But beneath the terminology is something deeply real, that the mind, fragile, creative, resilient, will find connection wherever it can, even in a vault, even in fear. And maybe in that realization, there's something quietly hopeful. Because if the mind can build attachment in the dark, then perhaps it can rebuild trust in the light. Even now, as you lie in stillness, your body remembers all the ways it has survived. It remembers the moments it fawned, the times it made peace to stay safe, the times it smiled through danger. And it deserves no shame for that, only gentleness. You are not broken for adapting. You are not weak for having loved where love should not have grown. You are human, and the human mind, yours included, is astonishing in its ability to keep going, even when it must make strange choices to do so. So let this story close with a whisper. You made it. Whatever vault you were trapped in, real or emotional, you found a way out, and that is enough. Ending. And that wraps up part 3 of the most disturbing experiments in psychology to fall asleep to. From the eerie implications of the rubber hand illusion, to the haunting isolation of the well of despair, to the mind-bending mystery behind the split-brain studies, these experiments not only push the boundaries of science, but also challenge what we believe about the human mind. Some reveal just how easily we can be manipulated. Others expose the darker sides of obedience, perception, and identity. And a few left us with more questions than answers. So we want to hear from you. Which of these experiments disturbed you the most? Are there any famous or forgotten psychological studies that we should have included? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's start a conversation. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, share it with a friend who loves the darker side of psychology, and of course, subscribe so you don't miss part 4 and beyond. Until next time, sleep tight.